Picture your dinner tonight: steak, white bread, a cold beer, maybe some pasta. Every single one of those foods exists on your plate because half of Europe died. In the 1340s, the Black Death tore through the known world and killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of every human being alive. Entire cities emptied out, fields rotted, animals died in ditches with nobody left to bury them. And when the survivors crawled out of the wreckage, the food system they rebuilt looked nothing like what came before. The poor, the absolute bottom rung of medieval society, suddenly started eating like nobles. And the nobles, they were furious. Today we're going to follow the food, because what the Black Death did to the dinner table is one of the strangest, most counterintuitive stories in all of history. Let's set the scene. It's 1347. A fleet of Genoese trading ships pulls into the port of Messina, Sicily. The harbor workers who rush to meet them are immediately hit by something wrong. Most of the sailors are dead. The ones still alive are covered in blackened boils the size of apples, erupting pus and blood. Sicilian officials order the ships out of the harbor immediately. Too late. The rats had already left the ships. Here's the dark irony of how this started. Mongol forces had been besieging a Genoese trading city called Kaffa in Crimea. When plague ripped through their own army, the Mongols did something that belongs in a horror movie. They catapulted their infected dead over the city walls. The Genoese merchants fled, on ships, with rats, with fleas, with Yersinia pestis, one of the most lethal bacteria in recorded human history. Constantinople, Sicily, Marseille, Paris. Within 6 years, the disease had swept the entire continent. Peak years, 1347 to 1353. Local outbreaks lasted 5 to 7 months. The disease hit hardest in summer, when the fleas were most active, and slowed in winter. Florence lost 60% of its population. Venice, the same. Some French villages were left without a single living soul. Bodies piled up in the streets because there weren't enough people left to bury them. Milan actually survived relatively intact because its rulers walled infected families inside their own homes. Alive. Problem solved, in the most brutal possible way. By the end, Europe had lost somewhere between 25 and 30 million people. The continent's population didn't fully recover for 150 years, and all of that death is what set the stage for the most unexpected food revolution in history. The first thing that happened was simple and catastrophic. The farmers died. Medieval Europe ran entirely on peasant labor. Peasants planted, peasants harvested, peasants herded the animals. When they died by the tens of millions, the entire agricultural machine just stopped. Crops rotted in the fields. Cattle wandered through those same rotting fields untended, dying in ditches. One contemporary account describes a single pasture where 5,000 sheep lay dead, not from plague, just from neglect because every single herdsman was gone. There were even reports of pigs staggering and dying after rooting through the infected rags of plague victims. Everything was dying. Food prices doubled almost overnight. In some regions, estimates suggest up to 70% of Europe's fields went unplanted. And then something remarkable happened to all that empty land. Nature took it back. Forests crept over deserted farmland. Woodlands swallowed abandoned villages. Entire ecosystems regrew over places that had been cleared and farmed for centuries. It was so dramatic that some of these villages weren't rediscovered until aerial photography after World War I. But here's where the story gets interesting, because what replaced those grain fields wasn't more grain. It was something that would completely transform what ordinary people were allowed to eat. Before the Black Death, if you were a medieval peasant, your diet was bleak. Rye bread, barley pottage, basically thick gray grain porridge, some boiled vegetables. On a lucky day, a little bacon. That was it, every day, for your entire life. We actually have the receipts on this. Manorial records from a place called Sedgeford in Norfolk, England, show exactly what employers were feeding their harvest workers. In 1256, meat made up just 4% of a farm laborer's daily diet. 4%. The rest was bread, grain, and water. When the plague killed off half the workforce, the math changed completely. Grain farming, wheat, rye crops requires constant human attention. Plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting, you need bodies, lots of them. But raising sheep and cattle, you need about 1/5 of the labor. One person can manage a flock that feeds dozens. So across Europe, landlords made a ruthlessly practical decision. They took all that abandoned, unplanted land and turned it into pasture, and they filled those pastures with livestock. By the end of the 14th century, English manors had 50 to 70% more animals than they did before the plague. England alone was raising 60% more sheep. In 1486, one farmer in Suffolk was recorded keeping a flock of over 4,300 sheep on the sites of 2 entirely deserted villages where entire communities used to live. All of that meat flooded the market at exactly the moment when the surviving peasants had, for the very first time, real bargaining power. Go back to Sedgeford. By 1353, just 2 years after the worst of the plague, meat in a harvest worker's diet had jumped from 4% to 15%. By 1387, it was nearly 30%. In one generation, the diet of an English farm laborer went from grey pottage to beef, mutton, and ale. The poor were eating meat, and the ruling class absolutely lost their minds about it. The peasants didn't just stumble into eating better. The peasants didn't just accidentally end up eating better. They fought for it. When the Black Death ended, the survivors looked around and understood something new about their own worth. There weren't enough of them to go around, and any landlord who needed their fields worked would pay or watch their crops rot. Workers started moving between manors, demanding higher wages and better conditions. Employers routinely broke the law to compete for good laborers. One Essex ploughman in 1378 was lured with a new tunic, cash, and 43 quarters of grain. A Lincolnshire shepherd got illegal extra pay, plus the right to graze his own sheep on the lord's land. Think about that. A shepherd, someone who owned nothing, negotiating side deals with a lord. The English crown tried to stop this. The Statute of Labourers in 1351 legally froze wages at pre-plague levels. Almost nobody obeyed it. Then Parliament passed sumptuary laws in 1363. These were laws that actually tried to legislate what poor people were allowed to eat. Servants and laborers were legally restricted to meat or fish just once a day. For all other meals, they were supposed to go back to milk, butter, and cheese, the foods appropriate to their estate. The upper classes genuinely believed there was a correct food for each level of society, and the peasants were eating the wrong food. Those laws were completely ignored because the peasants had the leverage now, and they used it specifically to demand white wheat bread and high-quality ale, foods that had always belonged exclusively to the nobility. Contemporary writers were horrified. They complained that peasants who used to happily subsist on bean and bran bread were now eating like lords, that the natural order had been destroyed. They were right. It had been. It wasn't just the meat. It wasn't just that people were eating more meat. The entire purpose of grain farming flipped. Before the plague, barley and oats were what the poor survived on. They were baked into the coarse, dark bread of the lower classes. Wheat, white wheat, was for the rich. After the plague, peasants had enough money to demand white wheat bread. Wheat became the grain for people. And barley? Barley got demoted. Barley was now mainly used to brew ale and to feed the massive expanding livestock herds. A staple of the poor became animal fodder, because the poor no longer needed it. Meanwhile, grain prices had collapsed. So much farmland was empty, and so many mouths were gone, that basic food became dramatically cheaper. The people who survived the plague found themselves in the bizarre situation of being able to afford what their parents never could. The Sedgeford records capture this perfectly. Ale consumption in harvest workers' diets jumped from 13% to 41%. Bread dropped from 41% to 15%. Less bread, more meat, more ale. The medieval peasant diet as it had existed for centuries was over. Now let's talk about the ripple effect that went global. Before the plague, exotic spices, nutmeg, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, cardamom, were luxury goods for the nobility only. Arab traders controlled the routes from the East Indies, and the markup was brutal. Ordinary people couldn't afford them. They used onions, garlic, and herbs. The plague hit those trade routes hard. The mass death wiped out the labor forces maintaining the Silk Road. Caravans couldn't run. Ships were feared. Spice prices soared. The plague actually increased short-term demand for spices because people genuinely believed spices could cure it. Medieval doctors believed the plague spread through bad air, miasma, and since strong-smelling spices were supposed to purify the air, they became medicine. People walked the streets holding cloves and sweet herbs to their noses, believing the scent would protect their brains from the stench of the dead. The medical faculty in Paris officially recommended broth seasoned with ground pepper, ginger, and cloves as a protective measure. Cloves were placed directly in the mouth before entering the room of a plague victim. A potion called Four Thieves vinegar, sage, clove, and rosemary was supposedly used by looters to grant themselves immunity while robbing the dead. That recipe still exists today. You can buy it in homeopathic stores right now. But the disruption of the spice trade routes couldn't be fixed by just waiting. The old roads were too dangerous, too expensive, too unreliable. European nations started looking for a different path to the east. Portugal, Spain, ships pushing into open ocean. The Black Death's destruction of the Silk Road was one of the threads that directly unraveled into Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and the entire age of exploration. Half of Europe dies. A few centuries later, continents get discovered. History is wild. Not everything the plague changed about food was an upgrade. Because medieval doctors had no real idea what caused the Black Death, they blamed whatever was convenient. And unfortunately for future generations, a lot of what they blamed was fruits and vegetables. Fresh produce was considered cold and wet in the Galenic theory of humors. Cold and wet was bad, so raw food was dangerous. Florence literally banned the entry of unripe plums, fresh beans, figs, and raw almonds into the city. The authorities thought the fruit was spreading plague. That fear stuck for generations. A cookbook from 1500, 150 years after the Black Death, explicitly warned cooks to beware of green salads and raw fruit. They will make your master sick. And in 1569, more than 2 centuries after the plague, English authorities completely banned the sale of fresh fruit during an outbreak. 200 years of fear baked into culinary culture. Meanwhile, the things that were trusted, wine, strong ale, vinegar, spiced broths, became permanently embedded as symbols of health. Medieval physicians wrote formal prescriptions for white wine and clear beer. The Plague-era belief that alcohol was healthier than water lasted so long it became doctrine. And to be fair, in a world without water treatment, they weren't entirely wrong. But the cultural entrenchment of that belief lasted centuries past any actual need for it. So what specifically from all of this is still on your plate today? The earliest known recipe resembling macaroni and cheese appears in a cookbook called The Form of Curie, compiled around 1390. It's called macaroons, fresh pasta layered with melted butter and cheese. That cookbook was written for an entirely new audience, upwardly mobile peasants who now had money to cook ambitious food. Before the plague, cookbooks were written in Latin or French for elite master chefs. Afterward, they were written in everyday English, on cheaper paper, with longer detailed recipes. The audience had changed because the economy had changed. Mint sauce, still served with lamb in England today, traces back directly to post-plague peasant cooking, where sharp acidic sauces livened up basic dishes. Almond milk, now in every grocery store, was prescribed by plague-era physicians as a safe substitute for fresh cow's milk, which spoiled quickly and was feared during outbreaks. And quarantine, the word itself, comes from the port city of Ragusa, now Dubrovnik in Croatia, which forced arriving ships into 40-day isolation, a quarantino. The word and the practice both born from the Black Death. Everything connects back. Here's the thing about catastrophe. It breaks systems, and sometimes the systems it breaks were the ones keeping ordinary people down. The Black Death killed between 1/3 and half of everyone alive in the known world, one of the worst events in human history by any measure. But in its wreckage, the feudal food hierarchy collapsed. Peasants ate meat for the first time in their family's memory. Abandoned farmland became pasture. Spice routes broke and Europe sailed into uncharted ocean looking for new ones. The fear of raw vegetables lasted 2 centuries, and a recipe for pasta with cheese shows up in England in 1390. Everything on your dinner plate has fingerprints from that decade of death. If you want more stories like this, the hidden connections between catastrophe and the world we live in now, we post deep dives into history weekly. And if you want to read further, I've linked 2 books below that go deep on the Black Death and medieval food history, both on Amazon, both genuinely worth your time. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.